The church smelled faintly of lilies and dust. Sunlight poured through the stained glass windows in fractured colors, but none of it could warm Margaret Williams. Her husband's coffin rested at the front, polished to a gleam, surrounded by flowers that looked too alive, too beautiful for a day like this. She sat in the front pew, her hands trembling in her lap, while the whispers of her children floated behind her like shards of glass. "Finally, it's over," her daughter Elizabeth murmured. "Now we can get on with our lives." Margaret flinched. Elizabeth didn't lower her voice. "I told you we should have gone with the cheaper casket," her son Thomas replied with a chuckle. "It's not like he's going to know the difference. They were her children, her flesh, her blood. Yet, in that moment, they felt like strangers." Margaret pressed her eyes shut, and in the darkness behind her lids, she saw Henry's face as he had been in their final days. Tired, but still managing that wry smile when he squeezed her hand. "Trust me," he had whispered. "Everything will be all right." But nothing felt all right. The service ended with a hymn that seemed to float up to the rafters, carried by voices that hadn't known Henry the way she had for 42 years of marriage, of struggle, of building something from nothing. Guests filed past, offering brief condolences that slid past Margaret like smoke. "He was a good man. You're in our prayers. Let us know if you need anything." Empty words from people who would forget about her by tomorrow. Margaret nodded, a puppet on strings, as she followed Mr. Caldwell, the family attorney, into a small adjoining room where the will would be read. Thomas and Elizabeth were already there, perched on chairs like vultures, their eyes bright not with grief but with expectation. Caldwell cleared his throat and unfolded the papers. His voice was dry, formal, but each word seemed to slice Margaret open. "To my beloved children, I leave the sum of $12 million to be divided equally, as well as the 2 new vehicles purchased this year." Elizabeth gasped in delight. Thomas exhaled a laugh of triumph. Margaret's stomach sank. She had known about the money, of course, had watched Henry build his real estate business from a single property to an empire, but she had never imagined that their children would inherit so much, while she, Caldwell, paused, adjusted his glasses, then continued. "To my wife, my dearest companion of 42 years, I leave this letter." He placed a sealed envelope in Margaret's hands. The room went silent for 3 heartbeats before Elizabeth erupted into laughter, high and sharp like breaking glass. "A letter after everything! That's all you get!" Margaret sat frozen, the envelope heavy as stone in her lap. Thomas leaned back, smirking. "Guess you'll have to live off memories while we handle the money." Their laughter echoed in the small room, sharp and merciless. Margaret lowered her eyes to the envelope. Henry's handwriting danced across it, steady, deliberate. He had chosen every word, every stroke of the pen. Her fingers traced the seal, and for the first time since his death, she felt something stir inside her. Not despair, not defeat. Something quieter, deeper, hope. The drive home was a blur of sunlight and shadow. The house felt cavernous without Henry's voice filling it. For 42 years, this Victorian home on Maple Street had been their sanctuary. Every creak of the old wood, every worn path in the carpet held a memory of him. Now the silence was broken only by the tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway and the faint hum of the refrigerator. Margaret placed her purse on the kitchen counter next to the stack of casseroles neighbors had brought over food she couldn't imagine eating, kindness she couldn't stomach. She'd slipped the letter into her purse at the attorney's office, unwilling to open it in front of Thomas and Elizabeth. Their mocking laughter still rang in her ears. She made herself a cup of tea, a small ritual that had always calmed her nerves. The familiar motions filling the kettle, selecting the Earl Grey that Henry had always preferred warming the pot, gave her hands something to do while her mind raced. The children had left hours earlier, giddy with their sudden wealth, too busy calling banks and friends to spare her another word. As darkness fell outside, Margaret sat at the kitchen table with a single lamp burning. Her hands shook as she slit the envelope open. Inside was a single folded page, thick paper, written in Henry's familiar, meticulous script. "My love," it began. "By now you will have endured the cruelty of our children's laughter. I did not intend it to be this way, but I needed to reveal their hearts before I revealed the truth. They think they have won, but what they hold is only a shadow. What is real I have left to you." Margaret pressed the page to her lips, her throat tightening. The words blurred as tears filled her eyes. He had known how they would treat her. "You will find in this letter a small key. It belongs to a safe deposit box at the bank on Ashland Avenue. Everything I could not trust them with rests inside. You alone are meant to open it. Do not let anyone know. Do not let them take this from you. Trust yourself as I have trusted you. With love always, Henry." A small metallic clink fell into her palm as she unfolded the paper further. A tiny brass key, its number etched faintly along the stem. She held it tight, as if afraid it would vanish. Margaret sat for a long while staring at the key. Questions circled her mind. What could possibly be in that safe? Money documents, something he didn't want the children to touch. Her pulse quickened with both fear and anticipation. She thought of Elizabeth's sneer, the way Thomas had leaned back, triumphant, as though she had been dismissed from her own life. For years she had endured their disregard, small slights, dismissive words, choices made over her head. She had excused them, told herself they were young or stressed or simply didn't understand. But today, when they laughed at her, she saw their true selves, and Henry had seen it too. Sleep came in fitful bursts that night. Each sound outside made Margaret think of footsteps. Each shadow on the wall became a threat. But beneath the unease there was something else, a flicker of resolve, of purpose. Tomorrow she would go to the bank. Tomorrow she would learn what Henry had truly left her. And tomorrow her children's laughter might not echo so loudly. The morning air was cool and brittle, the kind that cut through thin fabric and made Margaret pull her coat tighter. She drove herself to the bank on Ashland Avenue, a modest brick building with tall glass doors, her heart pounding so loudly she could feel it in her throat. The brass key in her purse clinked with each step she took, like a secret whisper reminding her of what was at stake. The teller, a young woman with careful eyes, led Margaret into a small private room after checking the number on her key. "One moment," she said softly, disappearing into the vault. Margaret sat in the silence, her hands clasped, until the teller returned, carrying a long, narrow box. She placed it on the table, nodded politely, and left Margaret alone. Her fingers hovered above the lid. She thought of Henry, his quiet strength, his meticulous planning, his last words to her, "Trust me." With a deep breath, she lifted the lid. Inside, there was no jewelry, no stack of dollar bills as she had half expected. Instead, there were neat folders bound with twine and a thick leather journal. Her pulse quickened. On top of the files lay a sealed envelope marked in Henry's handwriting, "For my wife's eyes only." She tore it open. "My dearest," the letter read, "what you see here are the records of my real estate holdings, investment accounts, and business shares. These assets are not included in the official will. They are hidden in trusts and accounts known only to me and Mr. Caldwell. Their value is greater than the 12 million given to the children, much greater." Margaret pressed a hand to her mouth, trembling. "I leave all of this to you because I know only you will protect it and only you will know how to honor what we built together." The journal drew her attention next. She opened it carefully. Henry's handwriting filled the page's entries from the past year, sometimes weary, sometimes fierce. He wrote of his disappointment in the children, their greed, their disregard, their cruelty, even toward each other. He wrote of his love for Margaret, of his fear that after his death she would be alone against them. "This is why I chose this path," he had written, "not to punish them, but to reveal them and to give you the power to decide what comes next." The words blurred as tears slid down Margaret's cheeks. She felt a strange mixture of grief, relief, and something sharper, something she hadn't felt in years. Power. She gathered the files and the journal, sliding them back into the box. As she lifted it into her arms, one thought burned bright in her mind. Her children believed they had won, but they had no idea what their father had truly left behind. When Margaret returned from the bank, the weight of the box pressed against her arms as though it carried not only Henry's fortune, but the burden of truth itself. She had hidden the files and journal inside her closet, beneath blankets, in a trunk no one had touched for years. She told herself it would be safe there, but a seed of fear had already taken root in her, fear of her own children. That evening, the front door slammed open. Thomas barged in, first tossing his keys on the counter, his voice booming through the hallway. Elizabeth trailed behind, her laughter sharp and brittle. They were flushed with excitement, as if drunk on their sudden wealth. "Mom!" Elizabeth called, sweeping into the living room with a grin too wide. You should have seen the dealership today. 2 brand new cars gleaming in the sun. Dad really knew how to take care of us. Her words cut deliberate and cruel. Margaret forced a polite smile. I'm glad you're happy. Happy, Thomas echoed, striding in with his phone held up, showing off a picture of himself leaning against a luxury car. Happy doesn't even begin to cover it. You should think about selling this old place, Mom. Move somewhere smaller. You don't need all this space alone. Margaret felt the sting beneath his casual tone. Smaller meant forgotten. Smaller meant tucked away out of their way. She folded her hands in her lap, willing her voice to stay steady. This is my home. I'm not going anywhere. Elizabeth tilted her head, studying Margaret with narrowed eyes. You seem different, she said slowly, not as broken as I expected. Did Dad leave you something after all? The question lingered in the air like smoke. Margaret's heart thudded, but she kept her expression neutral. He left me memories, she said softly. That's enough. Elizabeth smirked, but her gaze sharpened, suspicious. Later, as Margaret carried dishes into the kitchen, she heard the faint creak of her bedroom door upstairs. Her pulse spiked. Quietly, she climbed the staircase. The sight that met her froze her in place. Elizabeth crouched beside Margaret's dresser, rifling through drawers. What are you doing? Her voice cracked like a whip. Elizabeth jumped, spinning around. I was just looking for a photo album, she stammered, though her cheeks burned with guilt. That's my private room, Margaret said, steel slipping into her tone. You will not search it again. Elizabeth's eyes flickered with something sharp resentment, perhaps even hatred, but she brushed past Margaret without another word. That night, as the house settled into silence, Margaret sat awake in bed, clutching Henry's journal to her chest. Her children no longer saw her as a grieving widow. They sensed something they couldn't name, something that frightened them. They were right to be afraid because for the first time in her life, Margaret wasn't going to bend to them. It was Elizabeth's idea to host a family dinner. She insisted it was to honor their father's memory, but Margaret knew better. The invitation was laced with arrogance. Her voice on the phone smug as she said, "Wear something nice, Mom. You'll want to see how well we're doing." Margaret arrived at Elizabeth's house with a heavy heart. The dining room glittered with new furniture, a mahogany table, silver candlesticks, expensive china that had never been touched before. Thomas lounged at the head of the table, a glass of wine in his hand, while Elizabeth flitted about, her smile stretched thin. When Margaret sat down, the conversation immediately turned to their recent purchases. 2 cars weren't enough, Thomas boasted. I put a down payment on a boat yesterday. Dad's money should be enjoyed, not locked away. Elizabeth laughed, her earrings catching the light. I'm looking at a vacation home in Florida. You should come visit Mom, though I'm not sure you'd enjoy the upkeep. Too much responsibility. Their words dripped with mockery. Margaret forced herself to take a bite of food, though it tasted like ash in her mouth. Then Thomas leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "Mom," he said, his voice casual but edged with steel, "did Dad Really leave you only that letter, nothing else?" The table fell silent. Elizabeth's gaze sharpened, waiting. Margaret set her fork down, carefully feeling the heat of their suspicion press against her. For years she had lowered her eyes, avoided conflict, let them steamroll her. But Henry's journal sat hidden in her trunk, his words burning in her mind. "Give yourself the power. Decide what comes next." Margaret lifted her chin. "Yes, he left me a letter, and it was worth more than any car or boat or vacation house you could buy." Elizabeth's lips curled into a smirk. "Oh, really? And what did this precious letter say?" "That's between your father and me." Thomas's jaw tightened. He slammed his wineglass down so hard the stem cracked. "Don't play games with us. If Dad left you something, we deserve to know. We're his children too." Margaret looked at both of them, and for the first time in years she didn't feel small under their glare. She felt resolute. "You may be his children," she said quietly, "but you were never his legacy." The air shifted heavy with tension. Elizabeth's eyes flashed, but she bit her tongue. Thomas muttered something under his breath, leaning back with a scowl. Dinner ended soon after the food barely touched. Margaret drove home under a moonless sky, her heart pounding, not with fear this time, but with certainty. They would come for her. She knew it. Their greed wouldn't allow them to rest, but she wasn't the same woman they thought they could laugh at. Not anymore. The storm came the next evening, not with rain or thunder, but with pounding fists against her front door. She opened it to find Thomas, his face red, his jaw tight. Behind him stood Elizabeth, arms crossed, her eyes sharp as blades. "Enough games, Mom!" Thomas snapped, pushing past her into the house. "We know Dad left you more than just that letter." Margaret steadied herself against the door frame. "You should leave." "We're not leaving until you tell us the truth." Elizabeth hissed, stepping closer. "Do you think you can sit there, smug, while we're left wondering what you're hiding? We're his blood. If there's more money, it belongs to us." Her words cut deep, not because of their meaning, but because of their emptiness. They spoke of entitlement, not love. Margaret thought of the nights she had stayed awake nursing their fevers, the meals she had scraped together when money was tight, the endless sacrifices. None of it mattered to them now. "I don't owe you an explanation," Margaret said, her voice trembling but firm. Thomas slammed a fist on the table. "Don't make this harder than it has to be. We could make arrangements for you, a care facility, perhaps. Somewhere you won't have to worry about all these responsibilities." The threat hung heavy in the air. They weren't offering care, they were offering exile. Margaret forced a calm breath, meeting their eyes. "I'm not going anywhere." For a moment silence stretched between them. Then Elizabeth sneered, grabbed her purse and stormed out. Thomas lingered a beat longer, his gaze searching Margaret's face for cracks, before following her into the night. The door slammed shut behind them, rattling the frame. Margaret's hands shook as she locked it. She knew then they would not stop. Their greed had become hunger, insatiable and dangerous. The next morning, Margaret drove to Caldwell's office. His secretary, ushered her into a paneled room where he sat behind a heavy oak desk, glasses perched low on his nose. "They know," she whispered as soon as the door closed. "Or at least they suspect. They threatened me last night." Caldwell leaned back, folding his hands. "Your husband prepared for this. The trusts are sealed. The assets are untouchable without your consent. Legally, you are safe." "Legally," Margaret echoed the word, bitter on her tongue. "But what about otherwise? You didn't see the way they looked at me." He studied her for a long moment. "You will need to be cautious. Do not let them know what you hold. And above all, do not underestimate them. Desperation makes people reckless." Margaret nodded, clutching Henry's journal inside her bag like a shield. As she left his office, the autumn wind caught at her coat, cold against her skin. She knew now that this wasn't only about inheritance. It was about survival. And if her children thought she would surrender, they had forgotten who raised them. Margaret should have expected it, but the sight still hollowed her out. It was late afternoon when she returned from the market, bags of groceries digging into her arms. The front door stood ajar. A chill rippled through her. She stepped inside, the silence louder than any noise. Upstairs, drawers yawned open. Her jewelry box lay tipped over necklaces, spilling like broken promises across the carpet. Her closet door hung wide, blankets tossed aside, the old trunk shoved out from its corner. The lock had been forced, splintered wood marking their impatience. They had been here, her children. She sank to her knees beside the trunk, rifling through the mess with shaking hands. The journal was gone, the files too. For a moment, panic stole the air from her lungs. Then her eyes caught the faint outline of the false bottom Henry had built years ago, a hidden compartment, invisible unless you knew where to press. She lifted it. There, safe and untouched, lay the real folders and the journal. They had found decoys, an empty binder, and old notebooks she had placed there herself days ago, half by instinct, half by fear. A ragged laugh escaped her. They thought they had won. That night, Margaret sat in the darkened living room, staring at the faint glow of the street lamp outside. Her children no longer saw her as their mother. To them, she was an obstacle, and obstacles are meant to be removed. But Henry's words pulsed through her. Give yourself the power. Decide what comes next. For years, Margaret had lived quietly, trying not to provoke, trying not to see the cruelty that had taken root in the people she had raised. She told herself patience was strength, forgiveness was duty, but forgiveness had only sharpened their hunger. If they wanted a game, then she would play not with fists or threats, but with something stronger, patience, cunning, and truth. She began to sketch a plan. In her mind, she would let them think she was weak, let them taste the bitterness of their own greed, and when the time came, she would show them what their father had truly left behind. As she tucked the real documents into a safer hiding place, Margaret caught her reflection in the mirror across the room. Her hair, silver in the lamplight, framed a face she barely recognized. Lined, yes, weary, yes, but no longer bowed. She thought of the girl she once was, the woman Henry had loved, the mother who had once believed her children's laughter was a gift instead of a weapon. That woman was gone. What remained was something sharper, something they had never imagined, and they would not see it coming. The knock on her door came just after dusk, soft and hesitant, nothing like the pounding fists of his parents. When Margaret opened it, her grandson stood there, tall, awkward in his growing frame, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his hoodie. Jason's eyes, though, were the same gentle brown he had as a child, wide with worry. "Grandma," he whispered, "can I come in?" Margaret stepped aside without a word. Jason walked into the living room and sank into the couch, shoulders hunched, as though carrying a weight far too heavy for him. "They're fighting again," he said finally. "Mom and Dad about you, about money. It's all they ever talk about now." His voice cracked. "I hate it." Margaret sat beside him, the distance between them closing in an instant. He was still just a boy, though the world was already trying to harden him. "They think you're hiding something," he continued, glancing at her with eyes both fearful and hopeful. "Are you?" The question pierced Margaret, not with suspicion, but with a kind of plea. He wasn't asking for money, he was asking for truth. Margaret reached for Henry's journal, which she had taken to carrying with her wherever she went. Slowly she opened to a page marked by her husband's steady hand. She placed it in Jason's lap. "They must learn that love is the only wealth that endures," Henry had written. "If they cannot, then they will lose everything. But if even one soul remains uncorrupted, then our legacy is safe." Jason read in silence, his lips moving slightly over each word. When he looked up, his eyes were wet. "He meant me, didn't he?" Margaret swallowed the lump in her throat. "He meant anyone who still understood what mattered. I believe that's you." For the first time since Henry's death, a spark of warmth flickered inside her. Here in this boy who had grown up surrounded by greed, yet still carried kindness in his heart, was hope. Jason leaned closer, lowering his voice. "They've been searching your room. They think you have papers. Mom told Dad that if they find proof, they'll take you to court." "I know," Margaret whispered. "Then you need help," he said. "You can't fight them alone." Margaret studied his face, so young, so earnest, yet already bearing scars from being raised by wolves. He wasn't wrong. Alone she was vulnerable, but with him she wasn't just defending herself. She was building something Henry would have been proud of. She closed the journal, resting her hand over his. "Then we'll fight together." His fingers tightened around hers, and in that grip Margaret felt something she hadn't known in weeks. Strength. The game her children thought they were winning had just changed, because now she had an ally, and she would need him in the battle to come. They worked in silence at first, Margaret and Jason, the dining table, littered with folders, envelopes, and the faint smell of old paper. The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked away the evening hours as Margaret sorted through decades of Henry's meticulous record keeping. Jason handled each document carefully, his long fingers tracing lines of text he barely understood, but his eyes were sharp, taking in every detail. "This is a trust document." Margaret explained, pointing to the legal terminology, and this one shows property holdings in 3 states. She moved through each file methodically, translating the complex financial language into terms her grandson could grasp. Jason examined a paper bearing his father's name crossed out, replaced by Margaret's. His brow furrowed. Why did Grandpa hide all this? Margaret paused, studying the earnest face across from her, so young yet already carrying the weight of divided loyalties. Because he knew what your parents would become, she said, her voice catching before she steadied it. He wanted me to have the choice to protect what mattered. Outside, the autumn wind rattled the windows, sending shadows dancing across the walls. Jason looked down, his jaw tightening. They don't care about family. They only care about money. Margaret reached across the table, touched his hand. And you! His eyes lifted to meet hers, steady and clear. I care about you. For a moment, the ache in Margaret's chest softened. Henry had left her alone to face their children's greed, but not entirely. He'd left her, this boy, this unexpected ally, with his grandfather's moral compass. As the evening deepened, they devised a plan. Jason would serve as her eyes and ears, reporting back his parents' schemes. Margaret would continue to appear vulnerable while secretly securing her assets. The deception felt foreign to her. She'd spent a lifetime being transparent, honest. But war required strategy, and make no mistake, this was war. What if they find the real documents? Jason's question hung in the air. Margaret's lips curved into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. They won't. Your grandfather built this house. He knew all its secrets. She showed Jason how to access the hidden compartment in the floorboards beneath her bed, invisible unless you knew precisely which knot in the wood to press. This is where we'll keep everything that matters. Later that night, after Jason had gone, Margaret carried the most important documents into her bedroom. She slipped them into the hidden space, then with trembling fingers transferred what funds she could into an account in her name alone. It wasn't everything, no, that would draw suspicion, but it was enough to keep her safe. The next morning, Margaret made tea and sat in the kitchen when Elizabeth stopped by unannounced. Her daughter's heels clicked sharply against the tile as she entered, her smile all teeth and no warmth. "Morning, Mother. You look tired. Are you eating well?" Her words dripped with false concern. She glanced at the table, scanning for anything she could seize upon. Margaret had left only a crossword puzzle in yesterday's newspaper. "I'm managing," Margaret said, lightly lifting her cup, "though I can't seem to finish this puzzle." Elizabeth's eyes narrowed. "Still reading Dad's letter?" Margaret feigned confusion. "Oh, that old thing. I tucked it away. It was just sentimental." The lie slid easily off her tongue. Elizabeth relaxed, but not fully. Something restless churned behind her eyes. When she left, Margaret allowed herself a small smile. They believed what they wanted to believe, that she was weak, fading, distracted. They laughed louder each time she played the part. But at night, With Jason by her side, she sorted documents, cross-checked accounts, and began to build walls they could never scale. 3 days later, Margaret decided to lay a trap. Elizabeth came for their weekly check-in, a thinly veiled surveillance mission. Margaret waited until her daughter was halfway through her untouched tea before casually mentioning the bait. "I found an old box in the attic," she said, stirring sugar into her cup. "Your father must have forgotten about it. I haven't had the strength to open it yet." Elizabeth's head snapped up, her eyes sharpened with hunger before she quickly masked it with a smile. "A box! What kind of box?" "Oh, just something he tucked away. Papers, maybe, who knows? Perhaps nothing at all." Margaret let the silence stretch, then changed the subject to the weather. But she saw the way Elizabeth's fingers tightened around her phone, the way her gaze flicked toward Margaret's purse resting on the counter. The bait was set. That evening, Thomas arrived unannounced. His tone was overly casual, his words rehearsed. "Mom, if you find anything else of Dad's, you really should let us handle it. You don't want to get overwhelmed with complicated paperwork." Margaret smiled faintly, masking the fire inside her. "Of course, dear. If it's important, I'll be sure to tell you." They left soon after, whispering together on the porch, their silhouettes sharp against the porch light. They thought they were clever. They thought they were closing in. Later, Margaret sat with Jason in the quiet of the living room. He had listened to her story, his face grave. "You really told them about a box?" "Yes," Margaret said, smoothing Henry's journal on her lap. "And now they'll claw at each other trying to get to it. But the real box, the one that matters, they'll never find because it's not in the attic." His brow furrowed. "Then where?" Margaret smiled, tucking a strand of gray hair behind her ear. "Where only Henry and I knew, and where only Caldwell and I can reach." Jason nodded slowly, understanding. Then after a pause, "Grandma, when the time comes, will you really destroy them?" The question hung heavy between them. Margaret thought of her children as infants cradled in her arms. She thought of scraped knees, birthdays, laughter that once had been pure. And then she thought of their sneers, their threats, their plan to lock her away. "They destroyed themselves," she said at last. "I'll only show them the truth." Outside, the night pressed against the windows, thick with silence. The trap was set. All that remained was for them to step into it. Margaret had expected them to search the attic while she was out, but she hadn't anticipated how quickly they'd move. The very next day, while she was at her weekly hair appointment, Jason texted her, "They're here, both of them, in the attic." A strange calm settled over her as she sat under the dryer, the text message glowing on her phone screen. She could picture them up there. Now dust motes dancing in the beams of sunlight through the small attic window, Thomas cursing as he shifted boxes, Elizabeth demanding they search faster. They would find nothing but Christmas decorations, old photo albums, and forgotten furniture. No box, no secret files, no hidden treasure, just disappointment and growing desperation. When Margaret returned home, she found the attic ladder still pulled down, the trap door open. Footprints in the dust marked their frantic search. She climbed the stairs, slowly surveyed the chaos they'd left behind. Boxes, upended trunks, pried open. Even the floorboards had been examined for loose panels. In their haste, they'd broken a lamp that had been Henry's mother's shattered porcelain, now scattered across the floor. Margaret knelt, picked up a piece of the broken lamp, and held it to her heart. Even now, they destroyed, without thought, without care. She closed her eyes and allowed herself one moment of grief for the children she'd lost long before Henry's death. Jason came by after school, his backpack slung over one shoulder. "They're planning something bigger," he warned, his voice low, though they were alone. "I heard them arguing last night. Dad wants to confront you directly. Mom thinks they should be more strategic." "They already confronted me once," Margaret reminded him, pouring him a glass of lemonade. "It didn't work. This is different." Jason's fingers tapped nervously against the glass. "They're talking about having you declared incompetent, taking legal control of your finances." The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. Incompetent, the legal term for someone incapable of managing their own affairs, someone who needed to be controlled, to be managed, to be locked away. Her children weren't just after Henry's money now. They wanted to strip her of her agency, her independence, her dignity. "They can't do that," she said, but doubt crept into her voice. "I'm perfectly sound of mind." "They're saying you're becoming forgetful, paranoid. Dad mentioned how you accused Mom of searching your room, said it was a sign of your deteriorating mental state." Margaret's hands trembled as she set down her cup. They were twisting reality, reframing her justified suspicion as delusion. It was insidious, calculated, and worst of all, it might work. An elderly widow, recently bereaved, acting strangely, who wouldn't question her mental state. "We need proof," Margaret said, finally. "Something concrete that shows their intentions." Jason pulled out his phone, hesitated, then played the muffled audio he'd recorded. His parents' voices spilled into the room, sharp, confident, dripping with contempt. "She doesn't know what she's doing," Elizabeth's voice rang out. "If we take it to court, the judge will see she's incompetent." Thomas's laugh followed. "We'll get everything she's hiding. Trust me, by the time we're finished, she'll be sitting in a home and we'll be sitting on her fortune." Jason stopped the recording. His hands shook slightly. "They're serious, Grandma. You need to be ready." Margaret reached across the table, took his hand in hers. Her fingers were cold, but her grip was steady. "You've done the right thing. Thank you." That night, Margaret sat alone long after Jason had gone. Henry's journal opened before her. Her husband had seen this coming. His words, written months before his death, stared up at her. "If they cannot love, they will try to devour. Protect yourself. Protect what matters." The next morning, Margaret returned to Mr. Caldwell's office. The attorney's lined face hardened as she played Jason's recording. "It's worse than I feared," he murmured. "But Henry prepared for this. There is something you haven't yet seen." From his desk, he pulled a sealed envelope. Henry's handwriting scrolled across the front. For my wife, if the children turn against her. Margaret's breath caught. Her hands shook as she reached for it. Open it, Caldwell said quietly. It may be the key to ending this. The envelope trembled in Margaret's hands as though it held not paper but the weight of her entire future. Caldwell leaned back, giving her space, his gaze steady. She broke the seal and unfolded the letter. My love, Henry's handwriting flowed across the page. If you are reading this, then the children have turned against you. I feared it might come to this. I could not change their hearts, but I could ensure they reap what they sow. Their inheritance was never free. Attached to their 12 million are debts, taxes, and liabilities that will surface only if they attempt to take what is yours. Should they push you into court, they will unleash a storm they cannot control, and when the dust settles, they will have nothing. Margaret's breath caught the words, blurring as she read them again and again. Henry had crafted not only a gift, but a trap, a net woven so tightly that greed itself would be the blade to cut them down. Caldwell slid another folder across the desk. These are the documents, he explained. Legal filings, tax records, loan agreements your husband concealed within the trusts. If the children stay satisfied with what they have, these will never come to light. But the moment they challenge you, he tapped the folder, they inherit ruin. Margaret stared at the papers, her pulse hammering. Part of her recoiled at the thought, destroying her own children, watching them fall from luxury into dust. But then she remembered the recording, their voices dripping with disdain as they plotted to cast her aside like refuse. She remembered Elizabeth rifling through her drawers, Thomas slamming his fist on her table. They had chosen this path. Margaret lifted her eyes to Caldwell. If it comes to that, will you stand with me? His expression softened. I made your husband a promise, and now I make it to you. Yes. When Margaret returned home, the house felt colder than ever, though the sun streamed through the windows. She sat at the kitchen table with the envelope open before her, Henry's words burning into her like fire. For years she had lived in fear of disappointing her children, of losing their affection, of being alone. But now she understood the truth. She had already lost them. What remained was a test, not of motherhood, but of strength. She placed the papers into a locked case she'd bought years ago but never used. Then, with trembling fingers, she tucked the key into her pocket. Her hands no longer shook. They thought her fragile, defenseless, but they had forgotten where they came from. They had forgotten the woman who had built this family alongside Henry, brick by brick, sacrifice by sacrifice. If it's war they want, she whispered into the stillness, then war they will have. And for the first time she almost wished they would try. For days Margaret moved carefully, every step calculated. She cooked simple meals, left the blinds half drawn, and let her children believe she was drifting further into frailty. They visited often now, not out of love, but to watch, to circle, to wait for weakness. She spoke less, smiled vaguely when addressed, and occasionally let her gaze wander mid-conversation, all performances carefully crafted to feed their narrative. Elizabeth brought a doctor to the house, a friend she claimed just stopping by. But Margaret saw the clinical assessment in the woman's eyes, heard the leading questions. "Have you been having trouble remembering things, Mrs. Williams, feeling confused about time or place?" Margaret played along, hesitating just long enough before answering to plant seeds of doubt. She even misplaced her reading glasses while the doctor was there, searching frantically before finding them on top of her head. The concern that passed between Elizabeth and the doctor was almost comical in its transparency. Thomas came with legal papers, just routine updates to Dad's estate, he insisted. Margaret pretended to read them, squinting at the fine print before reaching for a magnifying glass. What she actually saw were documents granting her children power of attorney medical directives that would strip her of autonomy. She signed on the wrong line deliberately, then apologized profusely. Thomas left frustrated, but convinced his mother was declining rapidly. All the while, Jason kept Margaret informed. They were consulting lawyers, gathering evidence of her supposed incompetence, preparing to file for guardianship. The court date was set for 3 weeks away. "Are you scared?" Jason asked one evening as they sat reviewing their own legal preparations. The living room was bathed in the soft glow of a single lamp, documents spread across the coffee table between them. Margaret considered the question, searching her heart for the tremor of fear she'd lived with these past weeks. Strangely, she found instead a solid core of resolve. "No," she said, surprising herself with the truth of it. "I'm sad, but I'm not scared." Jason's eyes, so like Henry's, studied her face. "You've changed, Grandma. Loss either breaks you or forges you," Margaret replied, gathering the papers into a neat stack. "I refused to break." The storm of their children's making drew closer. 3 days before the court hearing, Margaret implemented the final stage of her plan. She called Elizabeth, her voice deliberately frail. "I've been thinking about that box I mentioned," she said, pausing to cough weakly. "The one in the attic. I was mistaken. Your father kept it in the old shed out back. I think maybe you should look at it. I'm not sure I understand what's in it." Elizabeth's sharp intake of breath was audible through the phone. "Don't worry, Mother. We'll take care of it. Thomas and I will come over tomorrow." After hanging up, Margaret texted Jason, "It's done. Stay away tomorrow." The next morning, she watched from her bedroom window as her children arrived, not even bothering to knock before heading straight to the backyard. The old shed had been Henry's workshop, a place he'd spent countless hours building furniture and fixing household items. Now it stood weathered and neglected, its contents untouched since his death. Margaret observed as Thomas forced the rusty lock as they both disappeared inside. Minutes stretched to an hour. When they finally emerged, they carried a metal box between them, faces flushed with triumph. They didn't even glance towards the house before loading it into Thomas's car and speeding away. Inside that box, they would find exactly what Margaret wanted them to find: old financial statements showing transfers to offshore accounts, property deeds in her name, and a letter from Henry explaining his plan to hide assets from tax authorities. All of it meticulously forged, all of it designed to convince them they'd found the smoking gun, and all of it would lead them straight into Henry's trap. The courthouse smelled of old wood and dust, its tall ceilings echoing every shuffle and cough. Margaret sat at the defendant's table beside Mr. Caldwell, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Across the aisle, Thomas and Elizabeth leaned toward each other, whispering with smug smiles. Their attorneys, sleek and confident in pressed suits, arranged papers before them. They hadn't even looked at her when they entered, as if she were already gone. The judge, a stern woman with sharp eyes, called the room to order. Elizabeth's lawyer rose first, his voice smooth, rehearsed. "Your Honor, my clients are here because their mother, a woman in declining health, has been concealing assets left by her late husband. We believe she's no longer capable of managing her affairs and request guardianship be transferred to her children." Thomas and Elizabeth nodded solemnly, masks of concern painted across their faces. Elizabeth even dabbed at an imaginary tear. Caldwell remained still calm, waiting. When it was their turn, he rose slowly, his voice measured. "Your Honor, my client may be elderly, but she is neither incompetent nor deceitful. What we have here is not a question of her capacity, but of greed." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Thomas stiffened, his jaw clenching. Caldwell placed a thick folder on the judge's bench. Before his passing, Henry Williams prepared extensive documentation. These records reveal that the assets granted to the children in his will were not without burden. Attached to their $12 million are hidden debts, unpaid taxes, and penalties. Should they attempt to seize more, these liabilities are activated. The judge flipped through the papers, her eyes narrowing as she read. "Are you suggesting," she asked slowly, "that the children's inheritance is conditional?" "Yes, Your Honor," Caldwell replied, "conditional and binding. If they had accepted what was given to them, these debts would have remained dormant. By bringing this matter to court, they have triggered the very clauses their father designed." Elizabeth's face blanched. Thomas half rose from his seat. "That's impossible," he barked. "You're lying." "Order!" the judge snapped, slamming her gavel. Caldwell adjusted his glasses. "I assure you, Your Honor, the signatures, the trusts, and the filings are all legal and valid. Their father anticipated this very scenario." The courtroom hummed with whispers. Thomas and Elizabeth's lawyers frantically flipped through the documents, their confident expressions draining away with every page. Margaret sat still, her heart hammering, but her face serene. Henry had laid the trap years ago, and now it had sprung shut. The judge closed the folder with a decisive thud. "The court sees no evidence of incompetence. Petition denied. Furthermore, I advise the petitioners to consult financial counsel immediately. This matter has awakened obligations that appear considerable." Thomas and Elizabeth sat frozen, as pale as marble statues. Margaret rose slowly, leaning on the table, and for the first time she allowed herself a small, steady smile. Let them laugh now, she thought, because their laughter had just cost them everything. It began slowly, like the first cracks in glass, a frozen account, here a notice in the mail there, but soon the cracks spread, running jagged lines across the glittering facade her children had built for themselves. Thomas was the first to feel it. His new boat, barely a month old, was repossessed at the marina. He stormed into Margaret's driveway the next morning, red-faced, spitting fury. "This is your doing," he shouted, pounding on the hood of his car. "You ruined me." Margaret stood at the window, silent, the curtains drawn just enough to watch. He looked smaller, without the arrogance, his bluster deflating when no one answered the door. Eventually he drove off, tires screeching, but even that sounded desperate rather than powerful. Elizabeth's unraveling came more quietly. Creditors began calling her office. Her Florida vacation home, bought in haste and pride, slipped into foreclosure before she had even furnished it. One afternoon, Margaret saw her sitting in her car outside the house, her face buried in her hands. For a fleeting moment, Margaret almost went to her. Almost. But Henry's words in his journal returned to her. They must reap what they sow. The whispers spread through town quickly. The proud heirs of Henry Williams were drowning in debt. Their shiny toys stripped away, their names whispered with pity and scorn. Their laughter at the will reading had curdled into bitter silence. Meanwhile, Margaret walked to the market with her head high. Neighbors who once pitied her now nodded with respect, though none knew the full truth. Only Caldwell, Jason, and Margaret understood the scope of Henry's design. At night, Jason helped Margaret transfer more assets quietly, carefully into secure accounts, some in her name, some in his, for the future. They worked like architects, rebuilding from ruins, their bond deepening with each late hour spent over papers and signatures. "They're tearing each other apart," Jason told Margaret one evening, a faint note of awe in his voice. "Mom blames Dad. Dad blames Mom. They barely speak now." "Good," Margaret murmured, her pen scratching across the page. "Greed eats itself in the end." Yet even as satisfaction swelled, there was sorrow too. These were her children, her babies. Once she had rocked them to sleep, held their hands on their first day of school, kissed away scraped knees, and now watching them sink, she felt the ache of a mother's heart alongside the triumph of a wronged woman. But Henry had given her more than wealth. He had given her the power to choose, and she knew now that her choice was not to save them, but to show them the truth of who they had become. 3 weeks after the court hearing, Margaret received a call from Caldwell. Thomas and Elizabeth had requested a meeting. "They want to negotiate," he explained. "Their financial situation is dire. They're asking for terms." "What kind of terms?" Margaret's voice was steady, though her hand gripped the phone tightly. "Forgiveness of some of the debt, a payment plan for the rest, and," Caldwell paused, "an acknowledgement from you that the arrangement was excessive." Margaret considered this, the olive branch so clearly born not of remorse, but of desperation. I'll meet them, she decided, but not to negotiate, to finish this. Caldwell insisted the meeting take place in his office, neutral ground. He called it a place where the walls could contain what was bound to break loose. Thomas and Elizabeth arrived first, their faces drawn, tight eyes hollowed by sleepless nights and endless phone calls from creditors. The arrogance was gone. In its place was desperation, a brittle edge of fear. They barely acknowledged each other, sitting on opposite sides of the room, as though even proximity burned. Margaret entered last, Jason walking quietly beside her. His presence was a steadying force, a reminder that not all bonds had rotted. Caldwell rose, greeting them with his usual formality before laying a thick folder on the table. "Thank you for coming," he began. "We are here to put to rest any remaining disputes concerning Henry Williams's estate." Elizabeth leaned forward, her voice sharp. "Disputes? You mean the lies she's hiding money? She's been hiding it from us since the beginning." Her words lashed out, but they rang hollow now, more a plea than an accusation. Thomas rubbed his temples, muttering, "We wouldn't be in this mess if you just told us the truth, Mother." Margaret looked at them, her children reduced to ruin by their own greed, and felt the ache of grief and anger entwined. Then she stood, her voice steady, each word deliberate. "You think I've hidden something from you," she said, "and you are right, but it was not mine to share. It was your father's final choice." Their heads snapped up. Margaret opened the folder Caldwell had prepared. Inside lay Henry's journal, pages marked and underlined alongside the legal documents they had triggered with their lawsuit. "Your father saw who you had become," she continued. "He gave you wealth and you squandered it. He gave you comfort and you demanded more. So he left me the real legacy, not to punish you, but to protect what mattered. And he tied your fortune to your greed, knowing it would be your undoing." Elizabeth's face crumpled, tears streaking her cheeks. "That's not fair," she whispered. "We're his children." "Yes," Margaret said softly, though her voice carried like steel, "but you were never his legacy. You traded love for money, family for pride, and now you have nothing left." Silence swallowed the room. Thomas stared at the floor, his hands clenched into fists, trembling not with rage but with something closer to despair. Margaret turned then to Jason, laying a hand on his shoulder. "This is who will carry his name forward, not you." The words landed like a gavel, final, irrevocable. Caldwell closed the folder with a snap. "The estate is settled. There will be no further contest." Margaret looked once more at her children, their eyes hollow, their pride broken, and felt the sharp aching sting of both victory and loss. The reckoning was complete, but the price had been high, perhaps too high. As she turned to leave, Thomas's voice stopped her ragged with emotion. "So that's it. You just cut us off, your own children." Margaret paused at the door, her hand on the knob. The answer that rose to her lips surprised even her with its clarity. I didn't cut you off. You severed yourselves when you decided I was worth less than what I could give you." With those words hanging in the air, she and Jason left the office. In the elevator down, Margaret's composure finally cracked. Tears filled her eyes as Jason's arm came around her shoulders. "It's okay to be sad, Grandma," he said gently, "even when you're right." Margaret nodded, unable to speak past the knot in her throat. She had won the battle Henry had prepared her for, but victory tasted bitter when it came at the cost of the family she had spent a lifetime building. Outside rain began to fall, a soft, steady patter against the windows, as if the sky itself mourned what had been lost. The house was unbearably quiet. For weeks, Margaret's days had been filled with battles, sharp words slammed doors, late-night whispers of strategy with Caldwell and Jason, and then, suddenly, silence. The court hearings were over. The papers signed the judgments final. Thomas and Elizabeth had vanished, leaving only the echo of their footsteps and the faint smell of their expensive perfumes and colognes clinging to memory. Margaret should have felt triumphant. She had won. The law had shielded her. Henry's careful foresight had sprung its trap, and her children were stripped of everything they had flaunted. Their cars, their houses, their boasts, all gone. But victory carried no laughter. It was heavy, solemn, almost mournful. She moved through the house, slowly touching the walls, as though they might crumble without Henry beside her. The ticking of the clock seemed louder than ever, each second a reminder that time moves forward even when your heart feels pinned to the past. At night, she lay awake staring at the ceiling, haunted by their faces in the courtroom, the hollow eyes, the anger collapsing into despair. Once she would have done anything to spare them pain. Now she was the instrument of it. Her mind repeated the same question over and over. What kind of mother destroys her own children? But another voice, Henry's, rose from the pages of his journal that she kept on the nightstand. Not destruction, he had written. Truth. They destroyed themselves with greed. You only revealed it, and yet the ache remained. A mother's heart never stops being a mother's heart, even when it is bruised, even when it is betrayed. 2 weeks after the final meeting at Caldwell's office, Margaret realized that Jason, who had been staying with her since the courtroom showdown, had become increasingly quiet and withdrawn. He spent longer hours in his room, made excuses to skip dinner, and his usual brightness dimmed to something more hesitant, more conflicted. "Is everything all right?" she asked one evening, finding him staring at his phone, his homework untouched. "I've been texting with Dad," he admitted, not meeting her eyes. "He wants me to come, stay with him for a few days. He's not doing well." Margaret felt her chest tighten. "And what do you want to do?" Jason looked up, his young face creased with a worry no 17-year-old should carry. "I think I should go. He's still my father, but I don't want you to think I'm betraying you." Margaret reached across the table and took his hand. "You aren't choosing sides by loving both of us. Go, see him, but promise you'll call if you need anything." Jason left the next morning, backpack over one shoulder, promised to return in a few days, hanging in the air. But 3 days stretched to 5 and 5 to a week, with only brief text messages as reassurance. When the school called about his absences, worry clutched at Margaret's throat. She tried calling Thomas's home, but the number was disconnected. Her calls to Elizabeth's cell went straight to voicemail. The silence expanded, filling the house with a new kind of dread, not for herself this time, but for her grandson caught in the crossfire. Margaret grabbed her keys and drove to Thomas's house, a modern construct of glass and stone that had once seemed to embody success, but now looked cold and abandoned. The curtains were drawn. The mailbox overflowed. When she knocked, no one came to the door. A neighbor, walking his dog, told her the family hadn't been seen for days. Back in her car, Margaret's hands trembled on the steering wheel. What had she done? In her determination to protect herself, had she driven her children to desperate measures? Had they taken Jason and fled? Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "I'm okay. Don't worry. We'll call when I can." Jay! Relief washed through her, followed quickly by a new surge of anxiety. Jason was alive at least, but the cryptic message suggested he wasn't free to speak openly. Where was he? What was happening? Days passed with no further word. Margaret contacted Caldwell, who advised her to wait. "If they've taken the boy against his will, that's kidnapping," he warned. "But if he's with them voluntarily, involving the police could escalate things." "They've lost everything," Margaret said quietly. "Maybe they blame me. Maybe they're trying to punish me by taking the one thing I still care about." Caldwell's face softened. "Or maybe the boy simply feels torn between loyalty to his parents and to you. Give it time." So she waited, the house growing more silent with each passing day. She tried to occupy herself planting bulbs in the garden for a spring she wasn't sure she would see, reorganizing bookshelves that didn't need organizing, baking bread that grew stale because she had no appetite. The neighbors stopped checking on her. The phone stopped ringing. The world moved on, unaware of the gaping hole in her life. On the 9th day after Jason's disappearance, Margaret woke to the sound of her doorbell. She rushed downstairs, hope surging, but found only a delivery man with a certified letter. It was from a small legal firm she didn't recognize, and inside was a handwritten note from Thomas. "Mother, I want you to know that Jason is safe with me. He chose to come with me when I lost my home. We are staying with a friend until I can get back on my feet. I don't want your money. I don't want your pity. I just need time to rebuild my life and my relationship with my son." The letter trembled in Margaret's hands. No address, no phone number, no way to reach them, just the knowledge that her grandson was safe and that her son, despite everything, was trying to be a father. It was both relief and torment. Jason was not in danger, but he was still beyond her reach. That evening, a car pulled into her driveway late at night. Margaret rushed to the window, hope surging again, only to feel it crash when she recognized Elizabeth's sleek sedan, now dusty from travel. Her daughter sat behind the wheel, not moving. Minutes stretched as Margaret watched her, wondering if she should go outside or wait. Finally, she decided whatever confrontation was coming, she would face it on her own terms. She opened the front door and stood on the porch, arms crossed against the autumn chill. Elizabeth emerged from the car slowly, none of her usual confidence in her movements. Her clothes, normally immaculate, were wrinkled. Her hair hung limp around a face drained of color. She climbed the porch steps with the careful movements of someone who might shatter. "Where's Jason?" Margaret asked, her voice sharper than she intended. Elizabeth flinched. "With his father. They're staying with Thomas's college roommate in Cedar Falls, about 2 hours from here." Margaret's heart constricted. A strange town, her son and grandson reduced to charity. "Why are you here?" Elizabeth looked down, her shoulders slumping. "I didn't know where else to go." Her voice cracked on the last word. Despite herself, despite everything, Margaret felt a tug of maternal concern. Her daughter looked broken, diminished. The Elizabeth who had sneered at her, who had plotted to lock her away, seemed to have vanished, leaving behind this hollow-eyed stranger. "Come inside," Margaret said finally. "It's cold out here." The kitchen felt too bright, too normal for the surreal situation unfolding. Margaret made tea out of habit, the motions automatic, while her mind raced. Elizabeth sat at the table staring at the wood grain as if it held answers. "They took everything," she said at last. "The cars, the house, even the furniture. I've been sleeping in my car, showering at the gym, pretending to be okay at work until they laid me off last week. I didn't know where else to go." Her words cut through Margaret, not because of pity alone, but because beneath the ruin she still saw the girl Elizabeth had once been, the child who had clung to Margaret's hand on her first day of school, who had whispered secrets into her ear at night. Tears stung Margaret's eyes. "You had somewhere to go," she said quietly. "You always had me, but you chose money instead." Elizabeth flinched as though struck. "I know," she choked out. "I was wrong. I was blind. Please, Mother, just help me." "What kind of help are you asking for?" Margaret's voice was steady, careful. She'd been manipulated before. "I don't know." Elizabeth's shoulders shook. "Alone, a place to stay, forgiveness." A bitter laugh escaped her. "No, I know I haven't earned that." Margaret studied her daughter, searching for signs of the old deception, the old hunger. But what she saw was simpler, rawer, a woman who had lost everything, including her pride. "You can stay tonight," Margaret said finally. "We'll talk about the rest tomorrow." She rose, went to the stove, and ladled soup into a bowl. She placed it in front of Elizabeth, along with a slice of bread. Her daughter stared at it as though it were a feast. Slowly, with trembling hands, she ate. When she finished, Margaret set a blanket on the couch. "Sleep here," she said. "You'll be safe." Elizabeth's eyes filled with tears. "That's all?" Margaret met her gaze steady, but not cruel. "That's what I can give today. Food, shelter, but not trust that you spent long ago." Elizabeth's lips trembled. but she nodded. She laid down on the couch, curling beneath the blanket, her sobs muffled against the cushions. Margaret returned to her room, the ache in her chest, both familiar and strange. Her daughter was under her roof again, but not in her heart. Some bridges can carry weight even after burning. Others are nothing but ash. The morning after Elizabeth's arrival, Margaret woke early and found her daughter already in the kitchen brewing coffee. The blanket was folded neatly on the couch. Elizabeth's face was puffy from crying, but there was a resolve in her movements that hadn't been there the night before. "I've been thinking all night," Elizabeth said, pouring Margaret a cup. "I shouldn't stay here. It's not right. I need to find my own way, fix my own mistakes." Margaret wrapped her hands around the warm mug. "Where will you go?" "My friend Diane offered me her guest room months ago. I was too proud to take it then. I'm not anymore." Elizabeth hesitated. "I also called Thomas this morning, told him I saw you. He was worried about you, actually." Thomas was worried about me. The irony wasn't lost on Margaret. After everything, Elizabeth looked away. "He's different now, humbled. When you lose everything, you start to see things clearly." She met Margaret's eyes. "I've been seeing a therapist. Since the court case, it's making me face some hard truths about myself, about how I've treated you." Margaret absorbed this information cautiously. It was the first sign that her daughter might be capable of growth, of change. But it was too soon to hope, too soon to trust. "And Jason, why didn't he call me?" "He wanted to. Thomas thought it best to wait. He was afraid you'd try to take Jason away." Elizabeth's voice was soft. "The boy's caught in the middle trying to be loyal to everyone." A new wave of guilt washed over Margaret. In the battle for justice, had she forgotten what mattered most? "Will you tell Jason I miss him, that he's welcome here any time?" Elizabeth nodded. "I'll see him tomorrow. I'll tell him." After breakfast, Elizabeth called her friend, arranged to move in that afternoon. As she gathered her few belongings, Margaret watched her, this stranger who wore her daughter's face, now etched with consequences. What Henry had set in motion couldn't be undone. The question was whether something new could grow from the ruins. When Elizabeth left the house, fell quiet again, but differently, not the suffocating silence of abandonment, but the patient quiet of waiting. Margaret found herself in the garden, clearing away dead leaves, making room for the bulbs she'd planted. Life would return in spring, whether she was ready or not. That evening, her phone rang. Jason's number. "Grandma." His voice was cautious, uncertain. "Jason." She sank into Henry's chair, relief weakening her knees. "Are you all right? Where are you?" "I'm with Dad. I'm okay. I'm sorry I didn't call sooner. Things have been complicated." He sounded older somehow, as if the past weeks had aged him. "I wanted to come back to your house, but Dad needed me. He's been struggling." "I understand," Margaret said, though part of her wanted to demand he return immediately. "You're a good son. He's trying, Grandma. He's really trying. He got a job at an accounting firm, entry-level stuff, but It's something, and he talks about you differently now, not angry anymore, just sad. Margaret closed her eyes, absorbing this. And you, what do you need, Jason? A pause. I miss you, he said finally, but I can't just abandon him. He's broken, but he's still my dad. You don't have to choose sides, she said, gently echoing her words from weeks before. You can love us both. They talked for nearly an hour, bridging the gap that circumstances had created. Jason promised to visit on the weekend. When they hung up, Margaret sat in the growing darkness, feeling something shift inside her. The anger that had fueled her through the court case was fading, replaced by something more complex, more bittersweet. 3 days later, Margaret sat at the kitchen table with a pen in her hand and Henry's journal opened beside her. The blank pages seemed to beckon, asking for a new chapter to be written, not about revenge or justice, but about what comes after. Are you rewriting it? Jason's voice startled her. He stood in the doorway, a small duffel bag at his feet, arrived for his promised weekend visit. Yes, Margaret said, rising to embrace him. It's time. For weeks she had avoided the task, as though leaving things unwritten might delay the inevitable. But Henry had entrusted her with more than wealth. He had entrusted her with the duty to shape what came next. That weekend with Jason back in the house, Margaret felt a spark of the family they might yet become. Not the family they had been that was gone forever, but something new, something tempered by fire, more mindful of its fragility. On Sunday morning, Margaret called Caldwell. By noon, he arrived with a fresh will, drafted the papers, crisped the ink ready. Together, they sat in the living room, sunlight spilling across the table as Margaret read through every line. To her children, she left not nothing, as she'd once planned in anger, but enough for security without excess, a modest trust that would provide income but not luxury, conditional on continued therapy and financial counseling. To Jason, she left the house, the bulk of the investments, the legacy Henry had hidden so carefully, now secured for a soul still uncorrupted, but with provisions to help his parents if they truly changed. When the pen touched paper, Margaret's hand no longer trembled. She signed with clarity, sealing the future not with anger, but with purpose. Caldwell nodded, his expression unreadable but respectful. "You've done what Henry hoped," he said. "You've chosen wisely." After he left, Margaret and Jason sat by the fireplace, the new will tucked safely away. He was quiet for a long time, then finally asked, "Why are you helping them at all after what they did?" Margaret turned to him, studying the boy who had stood by her when all others turned away. His face carried both youth and shadows of the man he would become. Because vengeance satisfied only briefly, but compassion can heal over a lifetime, she said simply. Your parents lost their way. That doesn't mean they can't find it again. Do you really believe they can change? Doubt clouded Jason's voice. I believe in the possibility, Margaret answered. True change is rare and hard won, but I've lived long enough to see it happen, and whether they change or not, I need to be someone I can respect. When I look in the mirror, Jason nodded slowly, absorbing her words. Grandpa would be proud of you." That night, as Jason slept in the room that was becoming permanently his, Margaret stood at the window watching the first snow of winter begin to fall. 30 days had passed since the courtroom victory that had felt so hollow. 30 days of grief, of anger, of questioning, and now perhaps the first tentative steps toward something else. The next month brought gradual, cautious changes. Jason divided his time between Margaret's house and his father's small apartment in Cedar Falls. Thomas found his footing at the accounting firm, moving from temporary to permanent status. Elizabeth enrolled in classes at the community college studying financial planning with a bitter irony that occasionally gave way to genuine interest. They did not become a happy family overnight. There were still arguments, still moments of distrust, still the ghost of what they had done to each other, but they were talking, meeting occasionally for coffee in neutral locations, sharing careful edited versions of their lives. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was communication, a start. 2 months after the courtroom showdown, Thomas called Margaret directly for the first time. His voice was hesitant, almost formal, as he asked if they could meet. She suggested the small cafe near the library, where she now volunteered 3 mornings a week. He arrived early, dressed in clothes that spoke of budget constraints, but careful maintenance. Gone were the designer suits, the expensive watch, the arrogance that had once surrounded him like armor. This Thomas was leaner, his face more lined, his eyes carrying a weight they hadn't before. "Thank you for meeting me," he said as he slid into the booth across from her. "I wasn't sure you would." "I wasn't sure either," Margaret admitted. "But here we are." They ordered coffee, the ritual giving them both time to find their footing in this new, uncertain territory. When the waitress left, Thomas placed a small envelope on the table between them. "It's not much," he said. "Just the first payment, $100. Margaret looked at the envelope without touching it. "Payment for what?" "The debt." Thomas's hands fidgeted with his napkin. "I know it's a drop in the ocean compared to what I owe, but it's a start. I want to make things right, or as right as they can be." The gesture was so unexpected, so earnest in its inadequacy, that Margaret felt her carefully maintained composure crack. This was not the son who had threatened to lock her away. This was someone new, or perhaps someone very old, someone she had known before money and ambition had corrupted him. "Why now?" she asked. Thomas looked out the window, gathering his thoughts. "When you lose everything, you think you've hit bottom. But I hadn't. Rock bottom was sitting in a motel room watching my son try to be brave while I wallowed in self-pity. Rock bottom was realizing that I'd become the kind of man my father had warned me against becoming." He met her eyes. "I don't expect your forgiveness, Mom. I probably don't deserve it, but I need you to know I'm trying to be better." Margaret sat back, studying her son's face, the familiar features now arranged in unfamiliar humility. She'd prepared for anger, for manipulation, for demands. She hadn't prepared for repentance. "Keep the money," she said at last. "Use it for Jason, for his college fund. But the debt, some debts can't be repaid with money, Thomas. She reached across the table, not quite touching his hand, but close. They can only be repaid with time and changed behavior. He nodded, understanding dawning in his eyes. That's harder. Yes, she said simply, it is. As winter deepened, the tentative reconnection continued. Elizabeth came to Sunday dinners bringing store-bought desserts and careful conversation. Thomas called weekly, sometimes just to update Margaret on Jason's activities, sometimes to ask hesitant questions about job opportunities or housing options. They were building something, not a restoration of what was lost, but the careful construction of something new. Jason bloomed in his role as the family bridge, carrying news and softening edges. His grades improved. He joined the debate team. He spoke of college with excitement rather than dread. Watching him, Margaret felt a fierce pride that transcended the pain of the past year. This boy, at least, would carry forward the best of Henry, the best of her, unburdened by the mistakes of his parents. In late January, Margaret received an unexpected letter from Elizabeth's therapist requesting a joint session. Elizabeth has been working through significant issues, the letter explained, and she believes that a facilitated conversation with you might be beneficial to her healing process. Margaret hesitated, uncertain if she was ready to excavate those wounds in the presence of a stranger, but after a sleepless night of consideration, she agreed. The appointment was set for the following week. The therapist's office was warm and neutral, with comfortable chairs and muted colors. Elizabeth arrived 5 minutes after Margaret, her face a mask of nervous determination. They sat across from each other, the therapist a calm presence between them. "Thank you both for being here," the therapist began. "Elizabeth has been working hard to understand her behaviors and make amends where possible. Today, she'd like to share some of that work with you, Margaret, if you're willing to listen." Margaret nodded, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Elizabeth took a deep breath. "I've been coming here for 3 months now," she said. "At first it was just to deal with the shock of losing everything, but it's become more. I've had to face some ugly truths about myself." She paused, steadying her voice. "I was jealous of you, Mom, of your relationship with Dad, of how he trusted you, respected you in a way he never did with me. When he died, I thought I could finally prove I was worthy of his legacy. Instead, I proved I was exactly what he feared, greedy, selfish, willing to hurt the people I should have protected." The words hung in the air between them, raw and honest, in a way Elizabeth had never been. Margaret felt her chest tighten, old pain mingling with new understanding. "I can't undo what I did," Elizabeth continued. "I can't erase the hurt, but I'm trying to understand why I did it, so I can make sure I never become that person again." For the next hour, they talked, really talked, for perhaps the first time in years. Elizabeth spoke of her insecurities, her misplaced ambitions, her tendency to value things over people. Margaret spoke of her own regrets, the ways she might have bridged the growing distance over the years, the blindness that had allowed her to miss the warning signs. They did not leave as mother and daughter fully reconciled. The damage was too deep, the betrayal too profound for such a neat resolution, but they left with a new understanding, a fragile foundation upon which something might eventually be rebuilt. As February gave way to March, the first crocuses appeared in Margaret's garden, pushing through the melting snow with stubborn determination. She knelt in the damp earth, clearing away dead leaves, making space for new growth. The garden had become a metaphor for her life, pruning what was dead, nurturing what might yet bloom, accepting the cycle of seasons with grace rather than resistance. One Saturday morning, as she worked in the front yard, a car pulled into the driveway. Not Elizabeth's sedan or Thomas's modest used Honda, but a sleek black Lexus she didn't recognize. The driver emerged a tall man in an expensive suit, his silver hair perfectly styled. "Margaret Williams?" he asked, approaching the garden gate. Yes, she stood brushing soil from her knees, suddenly conscious of her worn gardening clothes and disheveled appearance. "My name is Robert Jenkins. I was a business partner of your husband's." He extended a manicured hand. "I've recently returned from abroad and heard about the situation with your children. I wanted to express my condolences." Margaret shook his hand wary. "Thank you, Mr. Jenkins. Please call me Robert." His smile was practiced, polished. "Henry and I worked together for many years. He was a good man, a smart man." He glanced around the modest property, his expression carefully neutral. "I was surprised to hear about the arrangement he left behind. It seemed unlike him." Realization dawned. This man, this associate from Henry's past, had come to assess the situation, perhaps to offer help, perhaps to exploit it. "My husband knew exactly what he was doing," Margaret said, her voice calm but firm. "He protected what mattered most." Of course," Jenkins nodded quickly. "Still, if you find yourself in need of assistance, financial advice, investment opportunities, I would be honored to help Henry's widow, for old times' sake." Margaret studied him, seeing beyond the expensive suit to the hunger beneath. This man was cut from the same cloth as Thomas, and Elizabeth had been someone who measured worth in dollars, who saw relationships as transactions. "That's very kind," she said, "but I have everything I need." Jenkins looked skeptical. "Are you certain your situation must be challenging? And with your age—" "My situation is precisely as I wish it to be, Mr. Jenkins." Margaret straightened, drawing on the quiet strength that had seen her through the past months. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have gardening to finish." His smile faltered, surprise flickering in his eyes. He clearly wasn't accustomed to dismissal. "Of course, perhaps another time." He retreated to his car, the rejection sitting uneasily on his shoulders. As his Lexus pulled away, Margaret returned to her crocuses, a smile tugging at her lips. 6 months ago, she might have been intimidated by such a man, might have questioned her own judgment against his confident authority. Now she recognized the hollow confidence for what it was. Henry had given her more than money. He had given her the chance to discover her own strength. That evening, Jason called to say he'd be spending the night at his father's apartment. They were working on college applications together, Thomas insisting on state schools they could afford without touching the trust fund Margaret had established. It was a small thing, but significant. Thomas was learning to live within new limitations, to value substance over appearance. Margaret made herself a simple dinner and took it to the porch, watching as twilight settled over the neighborhood. The house no longer felt empty when she was alone in it. It felt peaceful, a sanctuary rather than a prison of memories. As darkness fell, she lit the small lamp beside Henry's reading chair and opened his journal to a fresh page. For months, she had been adding her own entries alongside his, creating a conversation that transcended his death. Tonight, she wrote about Jenkins, about the garden, about the slow, painful, beautiful process of rebuilding broken relationships. "You prepared me for war, Henry," she wrote, "but the harder battle has been finding peace afterward, learning when to hold firm and when to bend, when to protect myself and when to risk vulnerability. I think I'm finding the balance day by day." She closed the journal and held it to her chest, gazing out at the night sky. The stars were emerging bright points in the vast darkness. Henry had given her the map, but she had found her own way through the wilderness of loss and betrayal, and what she had discovered on the other side wasn't perfect restoration, but something perhaps more valuable: resilience, wisdom, the capacity to hold both justice and mercy in the same heart. Spring arrived in earnest, bringing with it a tentative new tradition: Sunday dinners with Thomas, Elizabeth, and Jason gathered around Margaret's table. The conversation was sometimes stilted, sometimes warm, always careful. They were learning each other again, these four people bound by blood and history, separated by mistakes, reunited by choice rather than obligation. There were still difficult moments. Elizabeth occasionally slipped into old patterns of jealousy. Thomas sometimes bristled when financial matters arose. Margaret herself struggled with lingering distrust, watching for signs of the old greed beneath their reformed exteriors. But they persevered week after week, building something neither whole nor broken, but healing. On a bright April afternoon, 1 year after Henry's death, they gathered at his grave. Margaret had not planned a ceremony, had not asked them to come, but they arrived anyway. Thomas with a small bunch of daisies, Elizabeth with a single white rose, Jason with a pebble to place atop the headstone in the Jewish tradition he'd learned from a friend. They stood together in the spring sunshine, the four of them, linked by loss and survival, by the man whose foresight had forced them to confront their worst selves and find perhaps their better natures. "Do you think he would be proud of us?" Elizabeth asked softly, her voice carrying on the gentle breeze, till of who we're becoming. Margaret studied her children's faces, more lined, less certain than they had been a year ago, but somehow more authentic. She thought of Henry's final gift to her, not the money or the property, but the power to shape what came next. "I think," she said carefully, "that he would be proud of who we are trying to become. The work isn't finished, may never be finished." She placed her hand on the sun-warmed stone of his grave. "But we're doing the work, and that would matter to him." Thomas nodded, his eyes fixed on the headstone. "I dream about him sometimes. He never says anything, just looks at me with this expression, not angry, not disappointed, just waiting, like he's waiting to see what I'll do next." "Me too," Elizabeth admitted. "It's like he's still watching over us, still expecting us to figure it out eventually." Jason placed his pebble carefully on the top of the headstone, a small act of remembrance, of continuity. "I think he'd be proudest of you, Grandma. You didn't just follow his plan, you made it better." Margaret felt a lump form in her throat. "We all did, are doing." She looked at her family, broken, healing, trying. "That's the real legacy. Not the money, not the property, but this, the choice to keep trying even after everything." They stood together a moment longer, bound not by perfect reconciliation, but by something more honest, the acknowledgement of harm done, and the commitment to a different path forward. Then, by unspoken agreement, they turned and walked back to their cars, leaving Henry to his rest. That evening, alone in the house, Margaret sat in Henry's reading chair by the window. Outside, the garden was coming alive with spring bulbs, daffodils and tulips reaching for the sun, their bright colors a stark contrast to the solemnity of the day. She opened Henry's journal one last time, turning to the final blank page. There she wrote, not about the past, the betrayal, the court case, the ruin, but about the future, about Jason's college acceptance letters and the garden she would expand this summer, about the tentative steps toward healing with her children and the boundaries she would maintain to protect her peace, about the legacy she was crafting now, not of money or property, but of resilience, forgiveness, and enduring love. When she finished writing, Margaret closed the journal and pressed it to her heart. Outside, twilight softened the edges of the world, casting a gentle glow over the garden she had tended through winter into spring. Inside, the house hummed with quiet life, the refrigerator cycling on the old furnace, sending its last warmth of the season through aged radiators, the grandfather clock marking time with steady patience. This was her victory, Margaret realized. Not the courtroom triumph, not the financial security, but this, the peace she'd found within herself, the home she'd reclaimed, the family she was carefully, cautiously rebuilding. A different kind of wealth than Henry had amassed, perhaps, but no less valuable, no less worth protecting. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. Elizabeth and Thomas would continue their halting progress toward redemption, sometimes stumbling, sometimes retreating. The wounds of betrayal would occasionally reopen, requiring fresh attention and care. Trust would be built, slowly tested, often never taken for granted again. But tonight, in this moment of quiet reflection, Margaret felt something she hadn't expected to find again: hope. Not the naive hope of perfect restoration, but the wiser hope of meaningful repair. Henry had given her the tools to survive the battle, but she had found her own way to peace. She gazed out at her garden, at the new life pushing through soil that had seemed barren just months before. "We build again," she whispered to herself, to Henry's memory, to the future taking shape before her, different but stronger at the broken places. The light faded gently from the sky stars, appearing one by one in the deepening blue. Inside her quiet house, Margaret Williams sat, surrounded by the warmth of the home she had fought for and won, not through greed or deception, but through courage, truth, and the most revolutionary act of all, choosing love even after betrayal, the only wealth in the end that truly endures.